Hi, I'm Bonnie Pavese, and this is Do You Mind Video Lab series here.
And I'm Garcia. Welcome to the show.
In today's episode, we visit how genetics play a role in your longevity, what guides us to live longer better based on our personal history, and how we can help our body and brain to function at its fullest capacities.
It's a great topic. This is something that you and I could break up into a number of episodes in the series that we're doing. And what we're going to try and cover today are some of the things that I think are relevant immediately in terms of what concerns you, what concerns me when it comes to genes, genetics.
So let's talk about how do genes play a role in your longevity and living a good life, but also a long life.
Great subject. And I'll start by saying that I'm a student of the subject matter. So rather than say that I'm an expert, I'm a student. I'm learning myself. I want to know as much about the whole subject matter of genetics. What's the relevance in terms of exactly what you brought up, right? So,
I mean, it's such a new topic, right? Because we're just now being able to test our DNA.
correct, inexpensively.
Yeah.
It's much more democratic. 10 years ago, the same kind of testing that we could do now would cost infinitely more. Right now, you could probably get a good gene test done that'll tell you a lot about what's going on with your brain, your heart, your moods, your potential for cancer, Alzheimer's. Whatever it is that you're thinking about is relevant to you. And so far as your well-being or not, you and I can measure in terms of the gene tests that are available now.
So, for example, if you're predisposed for heart disease, cancer, dementia, diabetes, how do we start to prevent those things or prolong it?
I think...
Or prolong the time before you get
Sure,
diagnosed?
before it can hit you in a minute. Look, getting tested, getting a gene test is something that I now require within my practice. Everybody's got to get their gene test done.
And who are you using to do that?
I love Self-Decode.
Okay.
I think Joseph Cohen and his product are terrific because it breaks down the information regarding your genes and minds in English. Pretty much by simple categories, you can go and you can select yourself. What is it that you want to know? And it just pops up really well in a method that's very easy to make sense of and decipher, Bonnie.
So if you already have a disease, let's say it comes back and you're doing your diagnostics and something comes back that you already have it, or it comes up that you're predisposed for it, what are ways in which we can go about dealing with the scenario? Either scenario A, okay, now you have markers that are showing heart disease, or your DNA and your genes and your family's history are telling us, okay, you're 25 now, when you're 45, you might develop it.
Sure.
So what are the things we're doing? And obviously we need to kind of like categorize different, different diseases. And maybe we just pick, the ones that you're dealing with most with your clients.
Right, but let's say that a member of your family has Alzheimer's and you're concerned.
Yeah.
You're going to want to look for those particular gene mutations and see if indeed you carry them. Doesn't mean that you're going to wind up with Alzheimer's, but what you want to do is reduce your risk of that gene coming alive at some point in your life. So we already know that there are many contributing factors to just about anything that may concern you and cut your life short prematurely, right? So whether it's heart disease or potential for cancer and so on. My dad had prostate cancer. And when I tested my genes, I saw that I carried that gene sequence also. That immediately alarmed me to everything that I should be doing to reduce my risk of having prostate cancer. Right? And so far at 72, I seem to be doing fine. Dad was diagnosed with prostate cancer at this age, as a matter of fact.
And so what are the things that's, knowing that that's a specific one that you're at risk for, what are the certain things that you're doing to check in? Because, obviously if you're going to get cancer, you want to be at the forefront, stage one of finding it. And then what are other things that you're doing in your lifestyle choices to try to prevent that gene expressing itself?
So we already know that there are liabilities for any kind of cancer.
Yeah.
If you're a smoker, you're going to put yourself at high risk of just about any cancer that there is. Certainly lung cancer, I would say pancreatic cancer. So most of the data that I'm aware of right now would indicate that there are certain things that you need to avoid in addition, right? Besides what you're going to put in. Not smoking, not being abusive with alcohol, not driving your body to a dead end in terms of stress. All those kinds of factors may turn certain gene sequences on. Kind of like the lighting on a Christmas tree. They're quiet, they're quiescent, and the ones that are against you, the ones that are going to be a liability, how do you keep them quiet? And that's going to be the life outside of the gene, what we would call the epigenetic environment. How we eat, the air that we breathe, the actual living environment that we're inside of, whether we're fit or not. So all our practices, good or bad, are going to determine which gene sequences get turned on or off. And those are the gene sequences that are either good for you, really good for you, bad for you, or really bad for you.
Right. And so in your case with the prostate cancer sort of alarm, you want to say?
Absolutely.
What have you done in terms of your epigenetics, as well as, what are other things that we can do to sort of try to prevent? Let's go with cancer as the first one, because that's what we're talking about. Let's talk about cancer, because cancer in today's culture,
everybody's scared that you're going to get cancer. Sure.
Because
or Alzheimer's.
It happens so quickly, right? And there's no sort of control, and it really depends on when you catch it, what kind it is, and what the treatment options are for that particular type in terms of if you're going to, survive it or not.
Correct.
Right?
There's the first thing is to be informed.
Yeah.
So let's say get a gene test.
Okay.
Right, and we've been talking about the Garcia cancer test. This is a blood test that you can do that'll measure the possibility that you could have any number of one of 50 different cancers.
Right.
Right, and it does it by measuring different markers that are released by tumors.
And let's say that some marker comes back slightly elevated, or you've done your gene test, the self-code gene test, and it comes back you're predisposed for prostate cancer, and the Garcia maybe comes back slightly elevated, but it's not telling you have cancer, it's telling you this is a marker that you need to look out for. Right. What's the next step?
You're going to find the best urologist possible.
Right.
If that's the case, if it's prostate, right?
Yeah.
You want to get tested. You want to do a biopsy possibly.
Yeah.
And find out right away what's going on with you. On a blood test, you're going to use a PSA, which is a marker indicating prostate-specific antigen. You want it as low as possible. Typical range on a Quest lab test would be 0 to 4. Okay. So if your PSA is going up towards 4 or higher, you're at risk. For some men, it could be prostate infection. For some men, it's already indicating that you're at liability for prostate cancer. So often men do get biopsies, let's say, right? So if I've got enough indicators, gene test is saying one thing, blood test is kind of confirming it. Next is I'm doing a really deep dive with the Garcia test. Then I want to modify my practices. What is it that I can do? Now we know that there's a whole different way of looking at prostate cancer. For many men, it's watch and wait. So you may test positive, but it could be that that's not what's going to kill you.
So you may test positive, meaning it comes back that you are showing indicators of prostate cancer.
Correct.
But you don't necessarily have it yet.
Or,
is that what you're saying?
Let's say you have it, but now, as opposed to when my dad had it, is to watch and wait. Okay. For many men, the removal of the prostate, going immediately into chemotherapy or radiation, that tends to be a bit brutal. And I suspect that in my dad's time, back in the 1980s when he had it, and into the 90s, the thinking today would have been likely to wait it out.
Okay.
And
So that obviously is going to make a lot of people nervous. You're told you've got cancer. Let's wait and see what happens, right?
Sure.
And it's kind of like, let's keep an eye on it. Let's see, like, let's test again in a month or however it is. There's got to be things, obviously, first thing is controlling your anxiety around it and being mindful with meditation. But what else can we do, in terms of biohacking to slow down its progression?
We know that.
Or is there a way to completely eradicate it? So the next time you go in, you don't have any cancer markers. Like what's realistic here, but really what can we do to sort of say, okay, that's not the reason I'm going to die?
There are dietary guidelines. There are ways of eating that seem to be provocative when it comes to cancers and when it comes to prostate cancer.
And what are those?
Dairy for sure in men.
So cut dairy.
Cut dairy out right away.
Okay.
Seems like consuming.
Would you say to someone like myself who is just concerned about getting cancer one day, cut dairy now? Or is that something like later on down the line?
No, I think that if you're not at risk and you're genetically built and put together, you're hardwired so that you can consume dairy, then there's no problem there.
Okay.
And I think it's a very low liability for somebody who doesn't have those biomarkers, let's say. I think in a man who's got a high PSA, a biopsy's been done, there's a likelihood that this is an aggressive cancer. They may move on to eventually removing the prostate, and we know that there are plenty of people that survive and live very long lives afterwards. Michael Milken is a perfect example. He had his prostate removed. His father died of it. Right? And he's written about and very much advocated for certain ways of eating that reduce the risk of prostate cancer. So let's say diet.
Okay, diet. So what diet would you recommend?
I would...
So cut dairy.
Very low protein consumption.
Low protein.
Very low protein red meat consumption.
Okay. What about fish?
Fish I keep in. I would eat a Mediterranean diet.
Okay.
A classic.
This is our kind of favorite one that we kind of always go back to, right? Like we can test out our other diets and see if that's working better, but pretty much most people Mediterranean is the right way to go.
No question about it. No matter where you pick people from, I mean, there are variations of the classical Greek Mediterranean diet. If you go to Japan, you've got the Japanese styled Mediterranean diet.
Right.
I would call it Mediterranean almost.
Okay.
Right. So you've got the diet itself built up around a high consumption of plant-based material. Mm-hmm. Secondarily, a high volume of additional fibrous foods, certainly multicolored fruit. I think the high consumption of legumes makes a big difference. We know that there are properties in beans that seem to protect against cancer and protect DNA from producing cancer-like cells overall, right? And then reducing the amount of provocative carbohydrates. Get sugar out of the diet.
Got it.
Be modest with the amount of alcohol.
And you've got to really cut out alcohol once you're on the cancer train.
I mean, if you're diagnosed with it, it's kind of there's studies on.
I mean, some people say moderate amounts, right? But the research is very limited in terms of what actually is the right amount. Correct?
If you're talking to most people today that are talking about life extension and longevity, they're saying get all alcohol out.
Okay.
There's nothing good about it at all. I'm not going to say that. I do like my occasional glass of wine. I'm modest compared to how I used to behave 10 years ago, 20 years ago. And I'm grateful that I think I've offset the damage overall, right?
I think, though, that alcohol does go into your genes, right? Because, for example, my grandfather lived till 92, and he was very sound-minded, very fit, and had a whiskey or a scotch every single day. And he's fine.
Yeah, there are people that can smoke to the end of their lives.
Yeah. So we really, I guess the thing in here is we just don't know if you're that person or not, right?
Go get a gene test.
Okay. So if you get a gene test, it might tell you your
risk potential
of cancer, but what about of determining if you can or can't be an alcohol drinker?
There's also gene sequences that will tell you that too.
Okay.
The gene sequences that'll tell you if you're going to do good
So
with
would
coffee.
you say to go to
or not.
should we be looking into geneticists? Is that what they're called?
Say it again, Bob?
Like a geneticist, like you know, when you go to get tested for certain gene sequences, when you're pregnant, you speak to a genetics person.
Correct.
And because they can read your genes and things that have biomarkers. I mean, maybe it comes back with nothing, but it comes back with something.
There are people that specialize in particular gene sequences. For instance, let's say breast cancer, right?
Yeah,
So there
okay.
are oncologists that they specialize in breast cancer.
Right.
So they're going to test for the gene mutation, the BRCA mutation, that's going to indicate whether or not you're at high risk for it. If your mom had it, if your grandmother had it. And we know enough people in public, right? I don't want to mention any names, but we know celebrities that have had a mastectomy or a full mastectomy. I've got clients and friends that have done it because breast cancer ran in their families.
Right.
So once you've made that determination, then you want to see if you're really at risk or not. So you're going to do the gene sequence to find that out.
Right.
Or you're going to do the complete gene test.
Right.
So you can look all the way around.
Right.
Right? So we want to do a blood test because we want a snapshot of events as they are right now.
Right.
And then I want a gene test to see what's my long game.
Right.
Right? So between both, I can adapt my practices. And given that there's enough information about different aggravating agents for any number of cancers, then you're either going to move towards them or away from them based on what your concerns may be. And certainly the concerns that a gene test is going to indicate.
And then let's talk about, okay, so that's cancer. The other big topic is Alzheimer's. Obviously, none of us want to lose our minds while we're here. So, and there's a lot of progress being made in neurological disorders.
Correct.
You know, there's Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, dementia, a number of other things.
Sure, ALS.
MS, ALS. And now we can test our genes, right, for a lot of that. But
that's correct.
Let's talk about Alzheimer's, because that seems to be sort of the scariest, most common denominator that a lot of us have had, you know, grandparents, we've witnessed them go through that.
You're going to want to get tested if that is a concern. You may want to get tested even if that's not your concern. There are people that don't have any familial history.
Right.
And getting a gene sequence, that your gene sequence is done, is going to be a revelation. I think, given how long we live, given how long we may live, you want as much data that you can collect up front that'll tell you, again, you know, if you're going to play the long game, what are my risk factors? What are my chances? And then you live a life that's going to reduce that potentiality. Right. And there are enough studies now. You know, who knows what's causing Alzheimer's? There's a new revelation that's coming out very frequently about this new contributing factor. Is it the way that you get all these tangles within your brain? Is it different ways of metabolizing zinc? Is it a virus? Is it any combination of these factors coming together that produces Alzheimer's?
But in Outlive, in Peter Attia's book, he goes into it pretty much in detail of there are certain gene sequences when they sort of line up that really put you at the forefront of, like, in this essence comparable to stage 4 cancer.
Correct.
Like, you are most likely going to be a victim of this if you don't do XYZ.
That's correct.
So what is XYZ that we need to do in order to prevent that or delay the onset? Because I think the early onset is probably the saddest, right? When people over 65 start to, you know, lose their short-term memory and eventually their long-term memory.
Well, being fit seems to be one of the smartest things that you can do to push Alzheimer's off, maybe push it off permanently.
Right.
We know that there seems to be some attribution to being a fit individual that allows you to regulate that gene sequence and that potentiality.
But do we think it's a certain combination of how you're being fit? Because you're saying fit in terms of exercise.
That's correct.
Yeah.
But I would also say fit in other ways.
Okay.
In other words, sleep plays a huge factor in what's going to happen with your brain. There's a portion of your sleep where the brain actually relieves itself of a lot of neurotoxicity. Right? What's accumulated during a day, during a week, and so on. It's kind of like the lymphatic system. I think it's called the glymphatic system.
Okay.
And that system is clearing the brain out of accumulated debris from your day, your week, whatever, which can be contributing to the potential that's going to trigger an Alzheimer's gene, right? Or the potential for dementia.
Okay.
So I'm looking at so many factors if I want to reduce my risk for a compromised brain all the way down the road.
Okay.
And it isn't only for Alzheimer's. Certainly, if that's your concern, then you're going to want to follow just about almost the protocols that Peter T. is going to lay out, right?
Yeah, which are?
I,
For anyone who hasn't read the book.
Okay, so it begins again with being fit. You need to exercise.
Yeah.
So whether it's walking, whether it's some sort of aerobic activity and weight-bearing activity. Seems like weight-bearing activity plays a major role in the health of the human brain.
And then there's also the blood-brain barrier, right?
Well, you're going to have to, yes. You're going to have to look at having a diet that's extremely high in probiotics.
Okay.
And the amount of information about the relationship between the gut and the brain is immense at this point. We already know that if you have a history, let's say, of eating the standard American diet,
Lots of
which
sugar,
is sad.
yeah.
A lot of processed food, a lot of sugar, low plant-based food, a lot of overcooked food, a lot of fried food, a lot of seed oils in the diet. Then you're going to accelerate the speed at which your body's aging. You're going to accelerate the speed at which your neurons are aging. You're going to accelerate the speed at which your brain is aging. So there's a potential for Alzheimer. Eating the standard American diet or eating the standard Western diet is likely going to switch all the different sequences that, let's say, Peter Attia is talking about that lead to Alzheimer's, or that we already know are going to lead to it.
Okay.
Right? So it's removing, a lot of it has to do with removing, if you're interested in managing what's going on with your brain, all the potential triggers outside of you that could possibly then ignite and set off the gene sequences for Alzheimer's.
And in dealing with Alzheimer's, are there certain supplements you would recommend, or IVs, or tools, or what else can we do other than our diet and our exercise?
All right, so let's say in our sleep, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
and our sleep, yes.
Right, so let's
say, our last episode we talked about foundations.
Correct.
So let's say we've managed to ace sleep, exercise, and nutrition. Right? Those are keys for pretty much everything that we want to biohack. So now when we're talking about genes and disease, what can we do beyond that, beyond our foundation?
They're my opinion, right? And I'm not going to advocate this for anybody other than myself and people that are interested in my opinion. There are certain nutraceuticals, we've talked about, certain supplements that categorically impact the quality of your brain, both its structure and its function. And there's a category of nutrients also that are called nootropics, Nootropics. Nootropics are quasi-nutrients. They may be synthetic in terms of how they're manufactured, and they have a massive impact on how the brain builds itself and how the brain performs overall. So I'm interested in categories of nootropics that are going to offer protection, that are going to allow me to build better neurons overall. There's an enzyme that we produce called BDNF, brain-derived nootropic factor, and BDNF levels drop off with age. The belief was, certainly going back even, 10, 15, 20, in the 1980s, it was believed that the brain didn't continue to develop as you got older. It looked like everything would just fall off a cliff, right? And what we now know is that the brain keeps regenerating itself so long as you're alive. So we now know that we can take advantage of certain nootropics that you can consume either orally or nootropics that, you brought it up, IVs, that you deliver in an IV. Many people that are listening to us are probably already familiar with very basic IVs. Very basic one is called a Myers cocktail.
Okay.
Dr. Myers, I think, the guy must have been named, at some point back in the 50s or the 60s, created a formula. It was primarily intravenous vitamin C, intravenous vitamin B, some magnesium, maybe some other minerals, and that would be put in a big bag and pushed into your vein. These days, you can economize on that. There's what's called a push, where you can actually introduce a high amount of certain nutrients into your bloodstream in a shorter amount of time, let's say about 20 minutes more or less, instead of an hour to 2 hours. But we now know that there's so many more nutrients, and among them are nootropics that actually can go into your veins also. There's a peptide, and peptides we're going to elaborate on another episode, that are combinations of protein precursors that are called amino acids. So an egg is a perfect protein. It's got all the amino acids all configured in a certain way. You and I can take out any one of these amino acids, reconfigure them differently, almost like working with Lego toys, and come up with a whole new architecture. That particular new architecture of amino acids can have a profound impact on my brain. There's one that I like a lot called cerebral lysine. Cerebral lysine is a peptide manufactured in Europe, and it's not something that's easily available here. We do know that it seems to slow down neurodegenerative disease and illness.
Right.
And that's available both in a pill, if you can get it, and certainly in an IV form.
Okay.
But the studies on cerebral lysine are lengthy, remarkable, going
Great
back now
for brain
decades.
health.
Huh?
Great for brain health and preventing dementia,
You got it.
essentially.
Right?
And
it's
potentially
manufactured-
other neurological diseases, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And anybody can do a search online about cerebral lysine and find out a lot about it.
Okay. Okay, so we've touched on cancer, we've touched on Alzheimer's. Let's talk about the other big one, heart disease,
Sure.
which you said your mother essentially had heart disease her whole life.
Yeah.
And I remember when she was alive, you just going over and over, she was having some heart attacks, right? And how different they are for men versus women. So let's talk a little bit about, what heart disease looks like, to witness it firsthand, and then what can we do, because that seems to be one that we really do know a lot about how to control and prevent its onset, at least, right? Like potentially you will get it one day and you may die of a heart attack, but there's a lot of ways in which we can prolong that happening or prevent it from happening at all.
Let's say if it runs in your family.
Yeah.
And you look at a gene sequence and your scores are alarming. You've got the different gene sequences that are indicating that the potential for your risk of a cardiac event are high, right? And we already know from different studies, different individuals that have looked at the problem from different dietary approaches that will reduce the risk of you building up plaque in your heart, atherosclerotic plaque, building up calcium in your heart, and clogging up your arteries, right? Inflammatory damage. There are ways of eating, there are ways of living that increase inflammation. Inflammation is central to a lot of the problems that we're talking about. What's going to take you out in the long run can be a kind of fallout of how inflamed your body is.
Right.
Right? So inflammatory damage happens to your veins, your capillaries. And there are people that you can see it pretty much right away. If you're overweight, if you're obese, if you've got a lot of endometrial fat, a lot of fat in your stomach, we know that that kind of fat puts your heart at much higher risk. The potential for you to have a heart attack or some sort of cardiac event goes up exponentially to the extent that you're carrying around a big load around your stomach. Right, so visually, we already know that that's a problem. If you're eating a diet, kind of like where we began, which is high in compromised food sources, high in processed sugars, carbohydrates, low quality meats, very little plant-based food, very little fruits, the polyphenols, which are compounds that are found in fruit, they give them the color.
Yeah.
Right, like blueberries or strawberries. If your diet's low in these particular foods and high in all the other ones, then the likelihood is that you're going to begin to cause inflammation throughout your body, certainly in the arteries and in the veins in your heart. And bit by bit, what you're going to do is build up congestion in your arteries and put yourself at risk, which I found myself to be at.
Right.
Here I am, a lifelong runner. I've been running since the 1970s, since I was in my early 20s. And once I entered my 60s, I found out that I also have plaque in my heart. How could that possibly be? Right? Is there a relationship between being really fit and heart disease? Yeah, there is, but it's not the only link that there is. Once I knew that I was carrying my mother's gene sequences for high LDL and building up plaque in my body, there were certain choices I had to make. And they had a lot to do with, I don't have that margin to go off that much. Certainly if there's a lot of saturated fat in the diet, I'm certain there are going to be plenty of individuals that are into the carnivore paleo diet that are going to be listening to us that will argue this. In my opinion, eating a high saturated fat diet and a low polyunsaturated oil diet, like olive oil and so on, that's going to put you at tremendous risk of building plaque up. So I think being informed, if you've got the gene sequence and it's obvious that you have a parent that has heart disease, what am I going to do now? Yeah. What's going to clean my arteries? What's going to increase nitric oxide, which is going to vasodilate my heart?
Do you recommend people taking nitric oxide?
There are nitric oxide supplements.
Yeah.
Right? There are nitric oxide foods. Beets are extremely high in nitric oxide. Okay. Beet supplements. There's a company called Neo 40 that makes chewable beetroot lozenges that increases nitric oxide. You work out better. For some men, it may help them with problems that they're having in their personal lives. Increasing nitric oxide will help immensely. Medical products that men use for concerns with ED, for instance, from Cialis to Viagra to Levitra, all of these, interestingly enough, seem to have the effect of relaxing the arteries around the heart. So it looks like, and they're all nitric oxide inducers.
Okay.
They'll increase nitric oxide.
So nitric oxide is a key supplement, if you want to call it that.
Absolutely.
That if you're predisposed for heart disease, you got to get on that.
Yeah, so I use arginine, I use citrulline.
Okay.
Citrulline is an amino acid that's typically found in red fruits, like watermelon's high in citrulline. Obviously beets, right? So anything red has high amounts of citrulline. So I take an extract of citrulline with arginine that actually increases nitric oxide. I'm not taking my chances in that regard. The other thing that I think is really important is the high consumption of omega-3 fatty acids, EPA, DHA. So where do I get most of my animal protein from? If you're adverse and concerned with heavy metals, that there's certain foods or fish that you're going to avoid. But for the most part, seafood tends to be central in terms of the proteins that I eat. And I'm going to consume an enormous amount of olive oil, what I call medicinal olive oil. Right?
Where do you get medicinal olive oil from?
Go online.
We're gonna link it for people to find a good.
There's several that I love. There's one called I think it's called Hyperion, and we want to put that in the link so that people know how to buy it. But it's olive oil made in Cyprus.
Okay.
And it's extreme. It's like triple virgin olive oil, kind of like that. The taste is very acidic, and it's very high in all the compounds that make olive oil medicinal in terms of reducing inflammatory damage and the potential to reduce the risk of a heart attack simply because of the way that olive oil functions within the body.
Let's talk about olive oil for a minute, because I know some people might get confused because seed oils have been marked as contributing to melanoma, right? A really bad skin cancer. So let's just talk about sort of the difference and why olive oil stands on its own as medicinal.
Well, not only seed oil, if you're going to eat canola oil, sunflower seed oil, corn oil, I mean, these are really nasty oils that are going to do damage to your body. And they don't really prefer any kind of benefit. It's just, they're just easy to extract from their sources. They're inexpensive, and they cause a lot of damage. And it was believed for a long time that they would play a role in reducing heart disease. Wouldn't you know it? All these years later, we find out that these particular oils, like corn oil, can actually increase your risk of having a heart attack and skin cancers. Exactly.
Yeah. But olive oil, we're certain of.
Well, olives are a fruit, right? And we already know the medicinal. I don't want to use the word medicinal too much.
Yeah.
But let's just say functional aspect of it. I lived in Greece for a while. I lived in an island called Santorini for about 4, 5, 6 months when I was a lot younger and interested in greater exploration of the world. But I'd get up every morning and oftentimes meet up with the fishermen that were going out 4, 5, 6 a.m. in the morning, and we would fish for our breakfast.
Right.
And then come back, and along with that, with whatever they would serve us, it would be a nice big hit of Greek coffee and a big shot of olive oil first thing in the morning. Sometimes we would cap it off at the end of the day. I didn't know that until I was living there and watching it for myself.
That it has such valuable properties.
Clearly,
Yeah.
and these are by all measures old men,
Right.
right? That they were still highly functional, and there are parts of the world where you're going to find that the levels of heart disease are much lower because of the high consumption
Right.
of olive oil.
And then to Peter Attia's point, he's all about your VO2 max.
Correct.
And strengthening that to prevent heart disease, which is, essentially how fast can you go for how long when you're exercising, right?
Well, fine. If you're interested in that, and I am, and I've measured my VO2 max, there are destinations. You can go to any number of clubs in New York or in your area. Do a search. Where can I get VO2 max tested in my neighborhood? And that's a challenge. It's to see how hard you can go before you fall, and then measure the amount of oxygen that you're consuming at that point.
Okay, so on the level of oxygen, I see you're always using your Boost oxygen spray.
Sure.
Oxygen's got to play a big role, I think, in preventing Alzheimer's, in heart disease, and even in like wound healing, right?
Sure.
Like now they're doing hyperbaric oxygen chambers. So let's talk about the benefits of oxygen across all of these diseases.
Or
and
no
genes.
oxygen.
Or no oxygen,
Right?
right? So you got to you got to get your blood pumping so it's producing and utilizing oxygen the strongest,
Correct.
most forceful way. But also, what about these exterior ways of getting oxygen in there? So we've got nitric oxide. That's also
Well, nitric oxide is critical as something that's going to make you stronger.
Yeah.
Right. That's going to protect your heart.
Yeah.
It's going to relax your veins, arteries, and capillaries, your whole vascular system. But it looks like also oxygen deprivation. If you ever go into people that live at high altitudes, we're at sea level right now.
Yeah.
So the oxygen that you and I are consuming is at about 21%.
Okay.
Right, and if we go up into Aspen and we go above that, 14,000 feet, oxygen levels drop. And I used to be a high altitude runner. We would go camping in the summers up in the Rockies, where the oxygen levels would drop down to, let's say, 16%. Right? So that puts a lot of pressure on you
their
to
lungs, yeah.
actually work out and get conditioned. But you get a tremendous reward in that your heart actually builds a stronger heart muscle. You have a higher volume of red blood cells. So when you come back to sea level, you just take off like a rocket.
Yeah.
So oxygen deprivation seems to actually have a great benefit on your heart.
So how can you do it if you don't have access to go to Aspen? What are we working with here at sea level?
You can buy devices. There are different companies that make devices that you can wear almost like a mask, and you can control the amount of oxygen that you're breathing so that you can mimic going up into high altitude, and it forces oxygen into you, and then it drops oxygen. So a technique that I think is wonderful is also reducing oxygen. So and there are devices that you can get that are called intermittent hypoxic training devices, IHT. Intermittent meaning that you're switching off low oxygen with high. And there's one that I have which is portable, and you can put it on like a mask, and you can control the amount of oxygen that you're breathing, both dropping it and increasing it. That builds a lot of lung power, but it also seems to strengthen the heart too.
Okay.
So IHT I think is remarkable, different than going into a hyperbaric tank where you're just driving pressure and oxygen into your body overall.
Right.
Right? So you want to do both.
Okay. So you want to do the hyperbaric tank as well.
Yeah, and I think recovering from illness, for many people that have chronic Lyme's, Bonnie, for many people that are returning from a severe illness, right? For me, hyperbaric was really critical in my recovery from long-haul COVID.
Mm-hmm.
And I think for some people, in terms of particular cancers, it's advised. But overall, in terms of your health, controlling inflammation, being in a hyperbaric tank and doing sessions on an irregular basis seem to also do a tremendous amount of repair, reducing inflammation around your heart. I have a dear friend, he's an MD based out of Miami, Dr. Andrew Levinson. And Andrew is probably one of the great authorities on hyperbaric tanks anywhere. That's somebody that people can Google, talk to, and for us would be a great guest also.
Let's talk, our last disease sort of talk about is metabolic disease.
Sure.
Type 2 diabetes and obesity, which seems to be plaguing everyone. And I know there's some amazing new drugs on the market for people who do have it that help with weight loss.
Correct.
Also helps with insulin resistance, which is a big one. And I believe they're saying that Alzheimer's is very closely linked with insulin resistance.
Very much so.
So that's important that we all get that under control.
Well, let's just.
But let's say, okay, go ahead.
If you're a high sugar consumer, and you're constantly driving your body with the high consumption of refined carbohydrates and sugar, you get to a point where you become insulin resistance, which is what you brought up, right? IR. And that's where your body's overproducing insulin to try and deal with the amount of starch and carbohydrate and sugar that you're bringing into your body. Sugar burns in your body at 98 degrees. You're a little furnace. You're cooking along until you're fully baked one day and then you check out, right? So your body will age and base at different speeds, also based on the amount of sugar that you consume. Sugar will melt in your almost 100-degree body, and it becomes a molecule that will attach to parts of your body and stiffen your ligaments and age your brain. And sugar, as it's metabolized in the brain and leaves a waste product, is called lipofuscin, which will also speed up your aging. Right? But the number one fucked up molecule is called an advanced glycation entity, AGE. As sugar melts in your body, it becomes this very aggressive molecule that begins to stiffen every part of your tissue. And it super speeds up the aging of your body, your organs, and your brain.
Yeah. What about, though, for people who work out? They eat pretty nutritious, but maybe sometimes they're having a pizza or pasta, probably more often than they should. But on the outside, they look fit, they're exercising, but they find themselves sort of teetering because of their genes on this. Well, you are at pre-diabetes, and they come to you and they say I don't know how I got here. What should I do? Aside from, we know we have our basic exercise and nutrition, right? We've got our eat the Mediterranean diet with intermittent fasting, along with do your exercise. What else are we prescribing them?
You may have to work with a diabetic specialist.
Okay.
I'll probably recommend you out. And you may want to consider any number of...
With an endocrinologist.
Correct.
Yeah.
Any number of drugs to regulate your blood sugar, right? From metformin to semaglutide. For some people, it's Ozempic. And there's a payoff. Manjaro.
Yeah.
These are all variants. IGLP-1.
Right.
They're all pretty much variants of the same drug, medication, peptide.
Right.
And...
just different brand names. Well, there's
exactly.
two, right?
And
there's trizipatide and then there's semaglutide.
Correct.
And then, you figure out which one works best for you. And I think trizipatide is looking like it's a faster, it works faster. And I think, and I could be wrong on this, we should look it up, but I think that it has less likelihood of decreasing your muscle mass, which goes back to what we were talking about before, muscle being maybe the most important thing as we age.
Correct. And what happens a lot of times, is you're going to just lose weight. And along with that is, you're going to lose fat, but you're going to lose muscle too, right? So if you're going to be looking to regulate your insulin resistance or your potential for type 2 diabetes, and your hemoglobin A1C is 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, and you just can't lose weight, it's going to be a whole lifestyle shift. It's not just going to be going on Ozempic, or metformin, or a combination of those things. You're going to have to work out and get fit, because you and I know this historically. What's the best way to get your hemoglobin A1C under control if you're not going to use meds?
You gotta exercise.
A lot.
A lot, yeah.
Right?
And what I find the best is like long, brisk walking works the best for me. When I'm doing that consistently, everything is in such a much better range, even on like a Mounjaro or a metformin, which those sort of help in bringing the amount of insulin you need to take down as a type 1 diabetic, and probably helps a person that's type 2 diabetic regulate or have less insulin resistance.
Correct.
But that's not going to help you balance your blood sugar levels. I think like exercise does.
Nothing beats exercise at all in that regard. We do know that, because you're going to consume a lot of sugar as you're working out.
And also just getting lean, which it's this conundrum for a diabetic is to get lean.
Sure.
Because being lean allows your insulin to be absorbed better, right?
That's correct.
Whether you're type 1 or type 2, but totally different diseases. But let's go with type 1. If you're lean as a type 1 diabetic, you're utilizing the insulin you're putting in your body much better than if you're not lean.
Wow. Right. Yeah,
and that's going to give you the lower A1C. It's going to prevent complications.
Correct. And then the other correction is, how do you sleep? We know that if you don't sleep well, if you don't sleep the right amount of time,
your metabolism's all over the place.
All over. In fact,
but that goes back to our foundation. So
exactly.
We're once again at our foundation of exercise, nutrition, and sleep.
Right. So if you want to deal with metabolic imbalance, metabolic disease, insulin resistance, then it's going to be a combination of, let's say, some aspects of mainstream medicine, for sure, and then a lot of lifestyle modifications that you and I have been discussing.
Yeah. And I think modern medicine, you need that, right? If you're in a crisis of type 1 diabetes, you have to take insulin. Like if your pancreas just isn't producing it, you have to take it. But if you want to have a difference between an A1C of an 8 and a 6, which is sounds little, but it's going to be huge in terms of preventing eye disease, heart disease, all these other diseases we're talking about, you really have to make the lifestyle changes that you're talking about and that you help people to make.
No question about it.
Yeah.
Right. So we pretty much covered the 4 horsemen.
Yeah.
Any one of the things that's going to kill you.
Yeah.
And we're starting off with measuring your genes. Right. Diagnostics is always right. Making sure that you get a good understanding historically.
Yeah.
And then become curious enough about what is it that may drive you towards the potential for type 2 diabetes and insulin resistance. You may already be there.
Yeah, but some of it might also be your community, right? Like what you're surrounded by, and the difference of, like you said, living in Aspen versus living in New York, and having, what's your threshold to like make your body work harder. You may be in a community of people who surround themselves with like fried fast food, or you may live in Greece where you have access to the freshest. You can go get your olive oil, pick it off the tree.
Right, but what's the statistic now in terms of how many Americans live off fast food? I think it's 1 in 5.
Yeah.
Right. So if you're in that category, who knows what the other 4 or 5 are eating? I mean, we've got a population where 70% of its inhabitants are overweight, and about 20% of that, 70% is obese, right? Including children, right? And so we've got a rising problem overall.
Yeah. But I think that the other problem is it's really hard to break away from that when that is your social community, right? And so when you're dealing with people who want to prevent this stuff, you've got to also look at what's your community and how are you going to be able to address your lifestyle changes you've got to surround yourself with other people who also are interested in that spiritual community as well.
No question about it. You do have to break away.
Yeah.
Remember, we're born into what we're born into. Right. Everything's already in momentum.
Right.
So if you're living somewhere where the practice is to eat certain kinds of foods and there isn't a lot of cultural intelligence about how it is that food impacts your genes, then you're going to be in trouble. You're going to wind up being a statistic within the CDC, you know?
Okay, and then to end, on this genetics, let's talk about CRISPR technologies, what's on the horizon in terms of genes and some amazing things that'll make this easier for everyone in the age of AI and, where we're going with it all.
So remember that I'm still studying CRISPR myself. I've got great curiosity about it, and I want to be better prepared to talk about it more. But let's say that CRISPR is equivalent of editing, right? Where at some point it's already begun, and we already know individuals that are doing this, whether it's sanctioned culturally, legally or not, right? In South Korea, in China, but who knows where else, where they're already going fast forward in terms of gene editing to actually create individuals or animals with certain features. So what are we talking about? We're talking about a particular technology that at some point, if it does enter the mainstream and it does become democratic enough so that people can use gene editing, yes, there's a good side and a bad side, just like AI. Everybody's talking about whether AI is going to cause the end of civilization, or will everybody have an AI doppelganger, hanging with them that will make their life easier. Who knows? We're going to find out. And down the road with CRISPR technology, we're going to have the ability to edit out a lot of the sequencing that may lead to cancers, may lead to Alzheimer, may lead to metabolic disease.
So let's say you've got that gene marker, but we've kind of determined at this point in this episode that if you have a gene marker, there's a lot of environmental factors that go into place in terms of turning it on.
Correct.
And we can control a lot of our environment.
That's correct.
And to a sense, or we can make choices about our environment to make it better.
That's right.
Which would lead to less opportunities to turn on those genes. Now, in the future, it almost seems like your environment might not matter if you can go in with CRISPR to snip out that gene.
Sure sounds like it.
Right?
Who knows?
It sounds like an easier, less suffering for humanity and potentially a longer mortality, right? Are we looking at what does it look like if you live for 150 years instead of 85?
Those are ethical questions that people are debating all the time. Aubrey de Grey is probably the preeminent geneticist that's pushing the whole conversation for living a long life. What's his point of view, like David Sinclair's, which is death is a disease that causes a lot of suffering. Can we bring an end to death, right? At some point, CRISPR technology or technologies like it that we may not know about now will show up, where you can edit out the gene sequences that are designed to kill you, right? To end your life. And there's conversations going on right now that the first person that will live to 1,000 has already been born somewhere on the planet. Right?
That sounds just crazy because we're trying to figure out how to live to 100.
Correct.
Right?
But
we just want those extra 15 years.
Correct. When Clinton was still president, in his State of the Union address, it was the second one. Excuse me, I forget which one. But he was already speaking when he was president in the 1990s about the fact that the first person who's going to live to be 100 in great condition probably was already alive. Here we are, several decades later, we're talking about not the first person that's going to live to 100 is already alive in good condition, but the person who will live to 1,000 is already born somewhere. And it just boggles the mind. Elon Musk just came out with the ability now to put the chip into your brain and how that will alter brain potential
right,
forever.
Neuralink.
Yeah, with Neuralink.
Yeah, but then that gets into a lot more ethics, which we'll talk about
Absolutely.
eventually.
I think a whole talk on
I
the
think a
ethics
talk
of
on
all this
Neuralink. I think I'll cut Neuralink out of this one. But I think let's end on this book you told me about, Biology of Belief by Barry Lipton,
Sure.
and how it relates to what we've been talking about in this episode, and why the audience should pick it up.
So this goes to the heart of my concerns, right?
Yeah.
Which is what can affect your life, your gene expression, that may fall into a very different category. But Lipton's contention, as best as I understand it in Biology of Belief, is your genes will not determine how your life turns out if you make a massive effort in terms of your habits and your practices, certainly mindfulness, more specifically meditation, and that meditation, meditative practices may actually be another path, another portal, another tool to quieting all the parts of your gene sequences that will kill you. And it's a big leap because there are geneticists and specialists within the field of studying how genes express that would say to you, look, there's no way that your environment or epigenetics really matter. 95% of you is determined by your genes. You're fully determined, and how everything's going to turn out is completely determined by the sequencing of your genes. Barry Lipton is saying the complete opposite, right? Joe Dispenza is saying the complete opposite. They're saying, and they're trying to build up a body of evidence, that how you think and what's on your mind may have a greater impact on how your life turns out than the genes that you're born with.
All right. That's a great note to end on.
Great.
For today. All right.
Right.